Hey you guys, so for my presentation, I'm going to discuss how the historical context of the gin craze lends itself to a better understanding of the texts that we've read in class, like how they became popular, that sort of thing. So it might sound sort of simplistic, but without the rapidly growing number of female readers who supported 18th century literature, the texts that we read in class probably may not have been as popular or well known. So believe it or not, this rising number of female readers, we owe their thirst for reading to gin. And so that's why I've titled my presentation, Hammered, Nah, Grammared Son, and OriGINs Story. Yes, I know. I don't know why I did that. Anyway, okay, so I'm hoping most of you are familiar with what gin is, but just in case you're not, I'll do a brief description and that sort of thing. So in the context of the 18th century, part of the reason that gin is called gin is because it was short for Geneva, a corruption of the Dutch word. I think it's how to pronounce it. I looked it up, but I'm only human. It's Genevieve, I think, which denoted not a city in Switzerland, but the potent elixir's juniper flavoring. So juniper is a type of berry, if you didn't know. And so gin is typically alcohol that consists of 70% fermented juniper berry. However, back in the 18th century, gin was usually composed of corn, variants of wheat, and then whatever else people could get their hands on. And that usually included juniper berries, but sometimes it was literally just anything. I mean, the extent to which people would just put whatever garbage they could get their hands on into the gin to make it less gross because it was so cheaply manufactured. They would go for it. So it was a little bit crazy back then, and it was twice as strong, the alcohol content, in the 18th century than it was now in our modern society. And they were so edgy with what they put into the drink that sometimes they would put sulfuric acid into some of the bins. I'm not kidding. That's an actual fact that I read in not just one, but many of the articles in scholarly resources that I consulted, which if you know anything about chemistry, you know that is not good for you. So needless to say, these people in the 18th century drinking this gin were a little crazy, but I digress. So how did gin get so popular in the 18th century and ultimately lead us to the conclusion that it impacted the amount of female readers who read in the 18th century? Well, it all sort of starts with our homeboy, William of Orange, which, if you remember, the sheet Stutz gave out comes from the house of Orange-Nassau. I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, William was a Dutch Protestant married to James's daughter Mary, and he was essentially prodded to take over England and establish a union between the Netherlands and England against France. So now William is thinking of the best way he can harm the French, and that's by damaging their wallets, which in this case meant restricting commerce between the two countries. The most popular drink in England at the time was French brandy, so William lowered the tax efforts and restrictions on the agricultural units of England so that they would make more British liquor. And so he passed an act that's called, well, it's just, to be frank, it's just for encouraging the distilling of brandy and spirits from corn in 1690, which helped drive down the price of corn and loosened up some of those restrictions for people to be able to farm more corn and therefore and things related to that make more gin, if that makes sense. So it was kind of giving them the resources through not making it super expensive. And so because of that, the production of gin just kind of goes bonkers. And so French brandy and all foreign liquor is essentially driven out of business, and the fashionable drink of the court pretty much becomes gin and liquors related to it. So it gets so crazy that during his reign, over 5 million gallons of to be produced every year in England, which was enough for every woman, man, and child to have a pint every week. I don't know if that kind of just sat there and processed for you, but that is a lot of alcohol, guys. That is a lot of alcohol. People were getting hammered all the time. All right, so next slide. So why gin? And I've kind of already hinted at this, but it's important to just make it solidified in your brain. So pretty much gin was accessible and took away the pain of living in squalor. A lot of people who came to London during that time period, because, you know, this was like right before like the real break of industrialization, when everything just went like, whew, you know, like right before then, when things were like on the cusp and people were starting to like usher into these cities. There were only 2 cities besides London that had 20,000 people or more. And London had 600,000 people at the time, around then. So it was a pretty drastic change from what a lot of the folks moving to this area knew. And it wasn't what they thought. Like, it was pretty nasty living in London, especially during the early 18th century. And a lot of people were, you know, very poor, living in just not ideal conditions, and so drinking took away that pain. And so an act in 1713 allowed for literally anyone to sell it. Like, they didn't need a license, they didn't need the proper qualifications, they didn't even need to tell the government anything like that. They could just sell it on the street, which, if you think that's crazy, it's because it is. So people were literally just selling gin out the wazoo, those who weren't even necessarily qualified to do so, because the government saw an opportunity to capitalize off of that and just tax everything and fund for world domination and, you know, the story of Britain, of them literally just taking over everybody. So that helped fund a lot of those escapades. And so the government really didn't disapprove of it, although there was a lot of contention within the court. And it's important to note that the Whigs were in power during this time, which, if you remember, are the more conservative political party. So they weren't like huge fans of all of this, but at the same time, they were like, she kind of making us money though. So that's kind of the balance that those two had. And then here's a little fun factoid for you. Even Horace Walpole's dad, the prime minister, was completely against it, which, if you know anything about Walpole, you know that he did not really like drinking. He did not really like that sort of stuff. He was pretty like pale and skinny, and that just didn't really fit his profile or his family. So the fact that his dad promoted it as well was kind of a big deal. So in essence, you know, in short, the reason it was so popular is because it was cheap. The government kind of let them get away with it, and because people needed an escape from everyday life. And it was way less expensive than foreign liquor. So that's why it started becoming popular and why it was so accessible. So then, now here I have a pretty pertinent quote that I'd like to read. So, between 1720 and 1751, the amount of distilled spirits consumed per person in England tripled. This is so-called gin craze was mainly an urban phenomenon among workers with limited financial resources and little leisure time. So just to kind of reinforce what we've already talked about, again, like this gin craze was partly due to the fact that they hated their lives. It was miserable. And when the economy was at this point where like food was pretty cheap, especially corn and like bread and that sort of thing, food was pretty cheap. They had a little bit of disposable income. You know, and if you know anything about the 18th century, you know that was not a very common thing for the lower class to have. And so what would they spend it on? What was the one thing that could entertain them cheaply in an urban city like London? Well, it was gin, because it's cheap, right? And so then the little bit that they had to spend, they would spend on that. And so it's important to note that, because it was almost a sort of like emulation. And I read about this in one of the dissertations that I actually used for this presentation. And it was just talking about how so much of this gin problem, we like to think that it's just a lower class, but it was actually it actually pervaded many of the classes, you know, middle upper, that whole thing, because they were all trying to get ahead and all trying to reflect one another. So the poorer people are like, oh, I can finally drink and kind of have this social space to do so, like the middle class. And the middle class is like, oh, well, you know, I can finally drink a little bit because these people in the course are drinking. And so it's just like this whole cycle, and it seems like it's very like divided, but they actually all had their own little part to play with gin becoming so popular. And so that's really important to know. And so why was it so easy, besides the fact that it was cheap? Like, where were these people getting the gin from? Well, they had machines like this. This is a Puss and Mew, and it enabled people to like get gin super easy. And so like a customer would put 2 cents in and gin would come out. If it looks sketchy, that's because it is. Look how nasty that looks. But people would do it because they are absolutely bonkers for gin, guys. They loved it. And while this was really unsanitary, many people actually did not get arrested. Actually, no one got arrested or ever got, their identity revealed because they were behind this Puss and Mew. So they could put literally anything in the gin. Like I said, they could put sulfuric acid. There are tons of other nasty things that I've read about that they would put in there, different types of poison, stuff like that. And people, they just did not care and they wouldn't get caught. And I've also read that some of these people who had these machines would have make up to 5 to 7 pounds, which back then is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It's like what an Instagram influencer probably makes in a day, but more, like a lot. And they would make 5 to 7 pounds a day based on these Puss and Mew machines, which is like insane. But yeah, so machines like this and just like the ease with which they were able to not only consume the gin, but find it, it enabled the city to start to, sorry, guys. Oh no, well, let me go back. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened. Anyway, it enabled the citizens of London to just have so much ease and accessibility with getting the gin, in a really nonchalant way. And so you just see things start to devolve really quickly. So now we can move on. So this is a pretty big deal. Once we get to, I would say, the climax or the apex of this whole problem, we see that people are drinking gin so much that, I mean, it's just littering the streets. People are getting drunk everywhere. Perpetual intoxication is just like littering the city of London, so much so that many artists would start to depict this scene for us. And so this is a really famous, if not the most famous picture talking about the gin craze, and it's titled Gin Lane. And so as you can see in this picture, there's a lot of different things going on here, but it's almost like the social force has kind of like lost itself. Like individuals' bodies suffer from addiction to gin. There's a sick mother who seems too drunk to even notice her baby is slipping away from her lap. Next, there's a pamphlet seller who carries the downfall of Mrs. Gin and is starving because no one is sober enough to buy anything from him. I mean, there's a cook and a carpenter who are selling things from their trade, things that they need to survive, to buy more gin. And so it's essentially just showing how unproductive everyone becomes when they drink this gin. I mean, look at that crazy mom's face as the baby's falling over the side of the railing. Like, that's insane. And you can even see that there's another mother in there. If I can't put my finger there and point for you. So if you want to pause and find it yourself, you can. But she has sores all over her legs. And even the one where the child is going overboard, like even that mom has sores all over her legs. So it pretty much was just to show that it was awful and it was destroying people's lives in a way that they probably did not expect. But again, the government was primarily using this whole thing for money to begin with. And so a good quote talking about the attitudes from then is from Men, who I read recently, and it says, "Gin turns individuals into unproductive people whose bodies reveal signs of sickness and decay," which pretty much just like sums up this picture. And then also it's important to talk about the different acts. So Parliament passes Acts 1729, 1736, 1743, 1747, and 1751 to aid in gin consumption control. And so it's pretty important to note that the government was kind of like a little bit did not know what they wanted. In the beginning, they're like, yeah, drink all the alcohol, let's tax it. And then once they see people get a little crazy, I mean, people are selling their livelihoods to get gin and that sort of thing. And crime is sort of skyrocketing, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. But once they start to see this happening, they're like, oh, wait a second, maybe we should like control it, but like we still want the taxes though. So like stop drinking a lot, but like still drink some, if you know what I'm saying. It's like they kind of don't really know what they want. They want the best of both worlds. And so these acts are pretty important. I read about them in this book by Warner. And I'll put that in my citations, obviously, but it was really, really interesting. And it was just describing the different impacts that all of them had. So I'm not going to talk about every single one of them because that would take too much time, but I will talk about the two most important ones. And that's the one from 1736 and the one from 1751. And so the Spirit Duties Act, which is also known as the Gin Act of 1736, established like a retail tax on gin and annual licenses for gin sellers. And so that meant that instead of being able to frolic about and sell whatever you wanted at any time, you couldn't do that anymore. They're trying to control it a little bit more than they were. They don't want it to just be this chaotic thing. And so it was also designed to curb gin consumption, obviously, but it was pretty much disobeyed like all the time. And again, like crime, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'll still talk about it right now because it's pertinent to this act. But it was out of control. People were rioting in the streets. You got so many people disobeying the law. I mean, they would like beat officers. They would do crazy, crazy stuff. And so it got so bad that they just gave up and repealed it in 1743, which is pretty funny. And then we get the Gin Act of 1751. And again, it was enacted to reduce the consumption of gin, which was a really popular pastime for a lot of people, as we've talked about, and was also seen as one of the direct causes of crime. But by prohibiting the gin distillers from selling to unlicensed merchants, which is what they're doing. So before we have the previous act, we have them saying, okay, you can't sell it unless you're licensed. And now they're saying you cannot give unlicensed merchants alcohol if you're a distiller. So like there's a little bit of difference there, but it's important. And it also increased the fees that they charged to merchants, which eliminated a lot of small gin shops and again restricted the distribution of gin to larger distilleries and retailers. So that's very important. Why? Because it shows how back and forth the government was and also how out of control it was that they had to repeal one of the major ones, and then that the second one wasn't even that controlling. Like they were really trying to kind of put a lockdown on this gin epidemic, as many people called it. But they were unable to do so primarily because there was just too many. There were too many drunkards who loved gin. So that's pretty important as we move on because, again, it just goes to show the complete devolution of London with this alcohol. Okay, so next. So, okay, I said I would talk about crime, and this is pretty important. Crime was going up, and so I'm going to read a quote. I didn't want to put it on here because it is kind of a lengthy quote, and I feel like it's better to be heard because I feel like it's more powerful that way. And so here's a really, really important quote from Skimmer that I think you guys will enjoy, and it will help illuminate to you just how severe the crime was. Rioting, an explosion at Westminster Hall, and threats to the life of Joseph Jekyll, the chief initiator of the act, ensued. 20. Moreover, sales of gin, after a momentary slump, actually increased after the 1736 Act, in part because selling and drinking gin constituted a form of political protest against a highly unpopular government. The rewards to informers offered under the Gin Acts of 1736 and 1737 were also a catalyst for crime. In the year following these acts, hardly a day passed in which an informer was not attacked on the streets of London, sometimes by mobs of 100 people or more. Again, so if that didn't describe to you perfectly exactly what was going on here, I don't know what will. Like, people are literally attacking officials with mobs, like hundreds of mobs. Informers and officers are afraid to go into the streets when acts get passed. And as we talked about before, which here, I'll go back for a second, with the Act of 1736, remember how it got repealed? Well, again, they said it was a catalyst for crime. Because people hated it so much, they would literally beat other people up in the streets. So it's just really, really wild, but important to know about how, again, I feel like I'm being repetitive, but I just think it's really important to hammer this home. It was a real issue. Like, again, it was a safety issue. And so something that started circulating around in the newspapers and in all sorts of places was the story of Judith DeFore. And she was used by the government and by the press to kind of be like, look, this is how bad the crime is, like that sort of thing. And it is pretty wild what she did. And so this woman, Judith DeFore, stripped her baby after strangling her with a dirty rag. Yeah, a dirty rag. Stripped her of her clothing, left her in the middle of a field, and then sold the clothes for more gin. Yeah. So that became a really popular story in the mid-18th century in London because it highlighted just how bad the crime was. And it is pretty insane. So yeah, people were doing really, really bizarre, outlandish things for gin. All right. And that was a problem, obviously. Okay, and then another problem that came about with gin, and this isn't really necessarily a problem by our standards as modern people, but it was back then, and that's social mobility. So the addiction to what they called Madame Geneva led to a peculiar mixing of the classes and genders. And so, like, men-only bars were soon overtaken by gin hubs where men and women drank side by side. The poor, middle class, and upper class all drank together as well. And women were able to be especially mobile due to their selling more gin than anyone else, which society did not like. So this is pretty important. I mean, before we see these male-only bars or pubs, whatever you would like to coin it, and just kind of socially mixing there, and it's only male, and it's usually middle upper to upper class. But now what we're seeing is, since it's so widespread and everybody's drinking gin, people are mixing left and right, and it's not just the classes, it's women and men as well. And women especially became really, really good at selling gin, and this is really important, and this added to this mobility. Since there wasn't like a lot of licensing going on, and if there was, like, people were disobeying it, as we saw with both of the acts that I mentioned. So women were selling gin left and right, and they were starting to make money for themselves and starting to kind of make names in their community. And not only that, but they would go to these gin hubs, and they would be drinking with other people, be like, oh yeah, this has like notes of like burnt corn in it, and people did not like that. They did not like the women of the 18th century sort of becoming so dependent on alcohol. In fact, many accounts say that they were the most dependent on alcohol out of anybody during this time period, out of men, out of children. I mean, hopefully not children, right? But seriously. And so it's pretty important, because not only does this contribute to a sort of anti-woman climate in the following years to come, but it also contributes a lot to the texts that we've read, and that we see a lot of interesting female characters who either completely lack reasoning and just give over to their passions, much like they did during the gin craze, or we see like crazy female figures who are, villains and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, this is kind of a problem during that society. Next slide. So someone who really, really spoke out against women becoming so dependent on alcohol was Eliza Haywood. And so Eliza Haywood, along with like a lot of other people, began advocating for the reading of novels in place of a gin addiction, which you might at first be like, okay, that's kind of weird, and why? But she was a really, really popular author. A lot of people read her books. She was one of the forefront romantic authors, that sort of thing. And so her saying this really started a trend throughout the country. So she says, reading, if they can be brought to it, is the best cure of all. In order to effect this, they should be suffered to dip into books of all sorts, by which genius may be caught. I know a gentleman that cures his sister with romances, for there is this peculiar in books, that the grave and the gay, the serious and the comic, are all full of dissuasives from the vice, drinking. Well, a habit of reading is well fixed. There's nothing easier than to bad taste, and to bring people from reading trivial to the perusal of valuable authors. So again, what she's saying here is, if you can, read, because reading is a lot more addictive and a lot more effective at combating this gin addiction. And she was not the only one who thought this. A lot of other people thought this as well. And she kind of started a trend, and other authors and other, writers and thinkers of the time started to promote this idea as well. And so another example of this is the story Pamela. And so Pamela is pretty much about a young man who is repeatedly sexually harassing another woman, and at points tries to rape her. So, like, for our standards, we're like, no. But in the book, she actually turns him around by writing him letters and writing, like, meaningful and virtuous prose to this man, and then he turns around. And so that's just another example of how during this time period they thought that if you read good prose or that sort of thing, that you could really turn around bad habits and all of that. So it wasn't just Haywood who thought that, it was other people as well. And so we're going to start seeing this sort of wave and insurgence of female readers. And it's a huge part of the re-edification of many of the middle and upper class women, which is part of the reason why we know the books that we know today, because they helped make them popular by simply reading them. Again, and so the link between increasingly popular novels and the female audience really just cannot be underestimated. So female readers are more empowered than ever to read. And so here's a really pertinent quote. Growing numbers of female readers could gain access to literary works through circulating libraries that were appearing in ever increasing numbers in British towns and cities. So with the enormous popularity of authors such as Anne Radcliffe, women were more and more accepted into the world of literature. This leap enabled many of the texts we read in class to be popularized. And so it sounds so simplistic and it sounds so like duh, but I don't think a lot of people knew that the gin was primarily the reason why women started reading again. And they were a massive audience for a lot of the texts that we've read in class, and that they helped people like Radcliffe get, catapulted into success. So, am I saying that we should, have a bunch of drunk people in our society? Obviously not. But there's something to be said for the changes that we've seen over this period of history. So there were 4 times as many books being published in 1790 opposed to 1700, and the literacy rate for women shot up 40 to 50%. Let's just pause for a second. That is massive. If nothing else convinces you how influential this kind of train of thought was of reading deters bad behavior and in turn will deter this gin addiction, then this should. That's 40 to 50%. That's a huge increase. And not only that, we see that it's 4 times as many books being published in just like a short 90-year period. So obviously women were partially responsible for this increase and for the popularization of many of the authors that we read in class, like Walpole, Radcliffe, Lewis, and Reeve. So I guess you could say gin walked so 18th century literature could run. And so here are my citations. I'm sorry I went a little bit over. I am a chatty person. And then I also will give Dr. Stutz my works cited. All right, well, have a good day. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation, and God bless.